The hunt for the Russian Federation's fleet, attacks on oil depots, and the real situation in Kostiantynivka. You're watching the War Map on Freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. So, let's start with the situation in the Black and Azov Seas, which Russia uses for oil transportation. Two tankers, two floating cranes, and one tugboat in the waters of the Azov and Black Seas were hit by unmanned systems, as well as a Project 10410 Svefliak patrol ship in Kerch. Moreover, between July 6th and July 16th, 147 ships were hit, including oil tankers, gas carriers, and tugboats. These attacks significantly disrupt logistics and fuel supply for the Russian army in temporarily occupied Crimea. Next, let's discuss the situation in Kostiantynivka. It remains under Ukrainian control. Fighters from the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, Skelia, released a video reporting that they had cleared the center of Kostiantynivka of occupiers, after which the soldiers raised the Ukrainian flag there. Fighting continues on the outskirts of the city. In addition, Ukrainian defense forces continue to control the skies over the city. These videos show the destruction of Russian drones, Zala, Supercam, Orlan, Scad, and Italmis. The total value of the downed drones is estimated at $1 million, which is a significant loss for the Russian occupiers. Now, let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Here, compared to last week, there has been a decrease in the number of combat clashes. This is because the enemy is unable to maintain continuous high-intensity pressure along the front line. Military expert Serhiy Grabsky spoke about this on our broadcast. At the same time, he added that the Russians have not changed their objectives. They're still trying to gain control over Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and over this entire agglomeration. This is the key route in the Pokrovsk direction, and as a result of local assaults, the occupiers are suffering massive losses. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is taking place near the settlements of Dorozhanovo, Novo-Alexandrovka, Suhitske, Rodinske, Hershine, Udachne, and Novoserhivka. All of these battles are being repelled by Ukraine's defense forces. Now let's talk about the Heliopol direction. Here, Russian occupiers continue their attacks and attempts to seize Ukrainian positions along the entire line of contact. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is currently taking place near the settlements of Horka, Tsvitkove, Vozdvizhenske, Verknya Tersa, Dobropilia, and Shavrine. Well, we'll discuss this and other topics in more detail with our guest in the studio. I'm pleased to welcome Dmytro Snegirov, a military and political analyst. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I'll start right away with the waters of the Black and Azov Seas, because from July 6th to 16th, 147 vessels of the Russian Federation were damaged or destroyed. And as of today, the number has already surpassed 150 vessels, and this figure includes both tankers and gas carriers. How much of an impact is this having right now on the Russian occupiers, especially those based in the temporarily occupied territories?
Let's take a look at the statistics provided by the Russian occupiers themselves, specifically the economic losses resulting from successful strikes by Ukrainian drones. We're talking about the fact that during this period, specifically the week you mentioned, Russia's revenue dropped to 1,068 million for the week, which is 200 million less than the previous period. So, as we can see, these are already very serious blows to the Russian economy. Moreover, it turns out that after the strikes on these oil tankers, and we're talking not only about the Sea of Azov, but also, accordingly, the Black Sea, the Russian Federation was forced to reduce its oil production. Moreover, OPEC countries note that at the moment, the Russian Federation is producing about 8 to 9 million barrels of oil per day, which is approximately, attention here, 830,000 barrels below even the OPEC quota. So we're already talking about a reduction in oil production. And most importantly, is that in addition to strikes on oil and gas tankers of the Shadow Fleet, strikes were also carried out on port infrastructure, primarily in Azov and Taganrog. And these Russian Federation ports are responsible for the economic side of things, namely the transshipment of grain, mineral fertilizers, coal, and heavy metallurgy products, including those stolen from the occupied territories of Ukraine. And here's the important part. The Russian side was forced to admit that the volume of Russian grain sales on the world market has dropped by 35%. In other words, this is a colossal pressure effect on the Russian economy. Let's note a decrease in the corresponding profits from the sale of petroleum products by 200 million in a week, plus, accordingly, a drop in the levels of Russian grain sales. So, in fact, what we're talking about is that thanks to this comprehensive operation, Ukraine's defense forces have put enormous pressure on the Russian economy. But that's the economic effect. And now, the military effect. Thanks to the strikes on logistics, the firepower ratio, for example, in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions, which used to be 2.5 to 1 in favor of the Russian occupation forces, has dropped to 1.5. In other words, the Russians currently do not have the ability to effectively use their strike capabilities. This includes both tube and rocket artillery. And this in turn has led to the Russian occupiers' advance slowing to a minimum. Moreover, in the Zaporizhia direction, Ukraine's defense forces have taken control of 34 square kilometers of territory, and at the junction of three regions, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk, 150 square kilometers have been deoccupied. The Russians themselves admit that, due to the blockade of the Sea of Azov and, consequently, the inability to supply logistics to the occupying forces, they're facing enormous problems with fuel and lubricants, as well as huge issues with rotating their personnel. And accordingly, there is no way to redeploy equipment. And all of this leads to the fact that Ukraine's defense forces are no longer gradually, but firmly taking the initiative in these directions.
Even the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdy, also known as Magyar, said that we are now routinely on duty in the waters of the Black and Azov Seas. We are on duty, and accordingly, we keep absolutely everything moving on these seas under aerial surveillance.
And notice, this is now the standard procedure. In other words, this has become a constant tactic of exerting pressure on the Russian Federation.
I want to talk about the situation at the front, specifically about the contact line near Kostiantynivka, because it's been more than 2 weeks since Putin personally, pompously, and loudly claimed that Kostiantynivka was supposedly under Russian control. But then the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, Skelya, published a video from the city center where they showed the Ukrainian flag and confirmed the clearing of the city center, having eliminated all Russian occupiers there. We're talking about small assault groups that enter the city and are then eliminated there by Ukraine's defense forces. And in Kostiantynivka, again, right now the fighting is only happening on the outskirts of the city. Is Russian propaganda really so desperate to find some kind of victory? Any victory that doesn't actually exist? And so eager to sell it to the Russian people? Why?
Because according to information from the Russian side itself, I'm talking about Russian OSINT analysts, the rate of advance by Russian troops over the past month was only 110 square kilometers. The Russian side itself was forced to admit that this is minimal progress compared to 2024 and 2025. Moreover, note that according to the Russian side's own assessment, the 110 square kilometers occupied by Russian troops is 3.5 times less than before. Now, let's take a look at the level of losses. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the occupiers are losing 1,500 or more personnel every day. And accordingly, somehow, the Russian public needs to be given an explanation for A, the massive losses, and B, the lack of real progress. And that's when reports of victory in advance start to appear, which, as we've discussed many times before, is nothing new. By the way, in the case of Kostiantynivka, the Russians were forced to acknowledge the data from objective monitoring, specifically that Ukrainian defense forces had taken control of the House of Culture, where, accordingly, the Ukrainian flag is now flying. And that's the center of Kostiantynivka. And this is, in fact, a complete informational collapse of the previous statements made by the Russian dictator about having full control over Kostiantynivka. What is happening now is that the occupiers are being forced to admit that the Ukrainian defense forces have achieved tactical successes on the flanks. This is Chasiv Yar, which they haven't been able to capture for 3 years, and this is Rusin Yar. And specifically, control over these flanks prevents the occupiers from creating an operational encirclement. As you rightly pointed out, their maximum advance is on the western outskirts, where unfortunately they managed to gain a foothold in the urban area. There is dense urban development there. This includes a multi specialty hospital, school number one, and accordingly other educational institutions. And so, thanks to the tactic of infiltration by small assault groups, they tried to create the appearance of full presence in Konstantinovka. But as we can see, the situation is exactly the opposite. Objective monitoring data, which is also confirmed by the Russian side, indicates that Konstantinovka is being held. Moreover, there are tactical successes on this front, along the flanks, and even the occupiers themselves are forced to admit this. And most importantly, the occupiers' losses. They admit that the inability to even infiltrate small assault groups, for example, from the eastern direction, leads to daily losses of up to 100 militants. And these are assault troops. So again, these are basically expendable forces who are being destroyed by Ukrainian drones even as they approach the city.
By the way, to confirm your words, CIA Director John Radcliffe publicly stated that right now, the average life expectancy of a Russian soldier on the battlefield is between 20 and 30 minutes. These are enormous losses, considering the intensity of the fighting and how the Russian military command keeps sending its own soldiers into these meat grinder assaults. There's another kind of loss I'd like to discuss with you: the losses suffered by the Russian occupiers. This is about Ukrainian ballistic missiles. Losses because, as we've discussed more than once, the Russian occupiers are very afraid of this, and especially so in the Kremlin. Here's a brief bit of information for now. What exactly is this Ukrainian ballistic missile? Because most of the details are kept secret. But from what is already publicly known, it will be able to strike targets at a distance of 300 kilometers and up to 800 kilometers from Ukraine's borders. That's good news, right?
Absolutely. And look, an 800-kilometer strike zone covers the Russian capital and St. Petersburg. And that's quite remarkable. The thing is, strikes on both Moscow and St. Petersburg are first and foremost not even about the military aspect. Although Moscow is home to up to 100 defense industry enterprises, which are legitimate military targets. But the point is that the informational and political impact of strikes on both capitals will be of enormous significance for the Russian side. And notice, this is happening against the backdrop of the absolute helplessness of the Russian air defense system. We all saw the spectacular footage of strikes on the naval base in Kronstadt, on the oil refinery in Moscow and the Moscow region, which led to a severe transportation collapse. But those were attack drones. And here we're talking about Ukrainian ballistic missiles, which Russian air defenses are unable to shoot down. That's what this is about. And most importantly, a strike range of 800 kilometers effectively allows for keeping all the defense industry enterprises in the European part under fire control. And these are the most high tech facilities, the very ones involved in producing cruise and ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, and guidance systems. This gives the Ukrainian side the ability to effectively block the production of strike weapons. But that's not even let's say, the most unfortunate news for the Russian side. The Russians themselves are forced to admit, I'll quote Russian public channels, that right now our strategic partners are developing a program to supply ballistic weapons, for example, those produced by the United Kingdom, with about $900 million invested. And we're talking about the Break Stop program. Moreover, the cost of the missile will be about $540,000, making it much cheaper than the British Storm Shadow counterpart. By the way, regarding production cost, it's already being reported in open sources that Ukrainian ballistic missiles, precisely because of their low production cost, will allow for scaling up production in the near future. That is, the low production cost compared to European and American counterparts will first and foremost give the Ukrainian defense industry the ability to ramp up production to quantities that can block both the economic and military components of the occupying country.
Considering that ballistic missiles in the Russian Federation can be shot down by S-400 systems, we can predict that very soon there may be a hunt by Ukrainian drones for S-400 systems, which, I'll repeat, are capable of intercepting ballistic missiles.
This targeted work is already underway. And notice how comprehensively the Ukrainian intelligence community is operating. While the Ukrainian defense industry is developing ballistic missiles, drones from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces are hunting S 300 and S 400 surface to air missile systems around the clock, 24/7. And notice it's not just happening in the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. There have already been recorded strikes on S 400 launchers in the Belgorod, Bryansk, and Voronezh regions. And this concerns the so called first echelon of air defense, which protects Moscow and the Moscow region. And notice the main point here. With the destruction of the S 400 air defense systems, a corridor to Moscow is essentially opened up. And what does a corridor to Moscow mean? Today, Sobyanin stated that over the past week, the Ukrainian side attacked the Russian Federation using drones 1,900 times. That's about 350 drones per night. Now, let's imagine a scenario where there are practically no air defense missile systems left. And actually, it's not even hard to imagine. The Russians themselves admit the fact that the air defense of the Russian Federation is so called spotty. According to the Russian side, about 150 Tor air defense missile systems are needed for layered defense of Moscow and the Moscow region, but they simply don't have them. And the general staff of the Russian Federation is forced to admit that there aren't enough of them to cover key logistical sites, such as oil refineries, infrastructure facilities, and accordingly, legitimate military targets. This is exactly what allows the Ukrainian side to continue effectively using ballistic strike systems to destroy legitimate military targets.
Well, this just isn't working out. After all, the Russian Ministry of Defense constantly says in its reports after every massive missile and drone strike on Ukraine that a missile factory was destroyed, a drone factory was destroyed, and a warehouse where drones were stored was destroyed. The targets were hit, everything was destroyed. And that very evening, 1,800 drones fly toward Moscow. So they lied to the Russians again, didn't they?
Absolutely. Moreover, I won't even quote directly, I'll just put it in my own words from Russian social media. The main military analysts note that Ukraine's military industrial complex currently has all the capabilities to scale up the production of strike drones by the end of the summer. And the key point is not just production, but also carrying out strikes on Russian territory, not with 400 drones, but up to 1,000. And they admit the fact that Russian air defense will be absolutely incapable. So the question arises,
1,000? Is that a single launch?
a single launch per day. Right now, we have the strategic initiative, we have the capability. Look at the report from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. How many Russian drones were used against Ukraine? 120. That's a colossal gap in favor of Ukraine. And this is happening despite, once again, the missile terror from the Russian Federation, where they claim that Ukraine's defense industry has supposedly been completely destroyed. And at the same time, on the very same day, they admit that by the end of the summer, the Ukrainian side will be able to launch up to 1,000 drones per day. An unprecedented lie for Russians, which is refuted by the Russian military themselves.
That is exactly why, according to the Center for Countering Disinformation, the Russian occupiers are planning an intensified mobilization after the elections in the fall.
Yes, these are the very developments we've already discussed with you in the studio more than once. This is the end of October. After the elections, there are plans, and even a number is mentioned. We passed this information to the Ukrainian intelligence community, up to 1,200,000. At the moment, there is a so called warming up of Russian society going on. In other words, they're preparing people for possible mobilization measures. For what purpose? The inability to change the situation on the front line, in other words, the actual lack of even tactical successes, forces the Russian political and military leadership to use tactics from World War II, better known as the Zhukov approach, no matter the cost. So, in fact, we're talking about the disposal of the male population of the Russian Federation. They will simply be driven under Ukrainian drones with no regard for the number of personnel losses. The Russian dictator needs an image. He needs to show some kind of success in the fifth year of the war, but there isn't any. And the only option is, once again, to completely dispose of the male population to achieve these illusory goals.
Dmitry, thank you so much for your analysis. Dmitry Snegirev, military and political analyst, was here with us in this studio. And let me remind you that you can find absolutely all the information about the situation at the front and more on our Freedom YouTube channel and Freedom Telegram channel. Subscribe and get the news straight from the source.